These aren't as spooky as the woods we're about to get into, but I figured the change of scenery was welcome for this one. Hi, my name is Marco, and welcome to another episode of the Storyline Sessions podcast. My guest this week is Miles Tritle. Although he has 2 novels under his name, he's probably the most known for his podcast, The Warning Woods. He published more than 100 short stories this way and also narrated all of them. He was also the second most listened podcast on my list in 2025, so I figured I had to get him on. We talked about horror, his process, his audio editing, and much more. So get comfortable and let's get into this week's storyline session with Miles Tritle. Enjoy. Hi Miles, welcome to Storyline Sessions. How are you?
Great, how are you?
I'm doing really well. So I've tried to put up the decor to something different than I usually do. I have some spooky stuff around me, so we're gonna talk some horror today. Interesting thing that I first picked up on when I discovered your work was actually that it's in the form of a podcast. So I'll just go from there and we'll circle back to everything that you do as a writer. How did that decision come by? I think we need to start from there because not a lot of people, and even if they do put out the audio of their work, it's like a second thing they do or like even an afterthought. But for you, it was straight into audio. So could you walk us through it?
Yeah, absolutely. So it kind of goes back to the COVID pandemic. You can, if you're watching the video, you can see they've got guitars all around me. I was primarily a musician. During that lockdown, I had just had my daughter was born, so I couldn't be loud playing music all the time. So I needed a new creative outlet and decided to write a book. And as I was going through that process, I started looking into the process of publishing. And what I kept hearing over and over again is just how difficult it is to break into publishing as a new author. And, you know, in this modern age of the internet and podcasting everything, it's relatively easy to drum up an audience of your own. So what I thought is, why don't I try to develop the audience first and kind of flip the process on its head, develop my own audience that I could then bring to a publisher to kind of, you know, give myself a little bit of something extra that I'm bringing to the table. And also, you know, just because it was a new sort of hobby for me, I wanted to practice writing. So I thought, well, what a great way to both practice writing by putting out a bunch of short stories and also develop an audience. And, you know, it was a little disheartening at first. Just the amount of time it took to build that audience surprised me, you know, which it probably shouldn't have surprised me, but just being new to everything, I didn't really know what to expect. And so then about 3 years in is when I really started to develop an audience, and I think simultaneously sort of find my voice and really hone my skills. So at that point, I was pretty invested in podcasting. I had not really written anything else in a while because, you know, writing a short story every week takes up most of my time. So it kind of just has become my thing, and I fully intend to do other things. But for the moment, you know, I'm very happy with the audience that I've found and the results, and also just the skills that I've been able to build through doing that.
And thinking about like where you started and a story basically every week, how's the tempo impacted your writing? You've revisited some stories, done some edits, because at the start you said, even I watched the Q&A where you said that some of the stuff went out unedited, but like through the process, how did that change for you? And also recently you kind of stated that you will be slowing down your pace to focus more on the work. So what was like that changing throughout the years?
Yeah, so at the very beginning, my stories were very, very short. The episodes were under 10 minutes, and then they slowly grew to be about 15 minutes. And at this point, I have many episodes that are over an hour long. I tend to average around about 45 minutes, which is about an 8,000 word story for my narrating pace. And yeah, so I got it in my head early on. I can't remember where I heard this, but some successful podcaster said that in order to really get your audience addicted to your show, you need to be regular. You need to be posting multiple times per week if you can, at least weekly though, so that they know when to expect it. And you can kind of become a part of their life. You can be a habit of your listeners to prepare for listening for your episodes and be ready for them when they come out. So I really adhered to that and stuck with a weekly schedule for years. And it worked out great. But over the last year or so, the numbers have kind of stayed stagnant. There's been a little bit of growth, but not nearly like it has been, or was a couple years ago, I guess, where it was just exponential. It's more like adding a few hundred listeners here and there. And what's been happening is I'm finding that more and more often, to meet that weekly deadline, I'm having to rush to the end of a story, maybe do less editing than I normally would like to. And it's a lot of late nights when I'm really tired that I end up working on these. So, I've decided that I've found my audience. They know where I'm at and they know how to find me. And I need to bring the best work I possibly can to them and not worry so much about getting it out at a specific time, just making sure the quality is really consistent. And also just because, this podcast it's a permanent record of my work, and I don't want that work to show anything less than my best, especially if I am to go on to other writing pursuits. I don't want to be sold short because I was trying to meet a deadline every week.
And the process of recording them, did you also evolve that? I mean, it's clear that you've been doing the audio from the start in a quite a professional way, and as we see on the setting, you do have that thing going on with the guitars. I assume that you have a home studio, but I think that a lot of people probably don't even know that you do the whole thing by yourself. And how does that look like when you need to focus on the production side of things as well? When do you say, okay, this is enough from the production side, I need to focus more on the writing, and vice versa? Where's the balance for you in there?
Yeah, I'm very fortunate in that I kind of came into this with all of the skills required up front because I started as a musician. You're right, I have a home studio set up here. I've improved it slightly and kind of geared it toward podcasting specifically. The microphone that I started out with was more for singing. It didn't really work as well for narrating, so this one works a lot better. And along with that came all the mixing and production skills as well. I tend to do the writing and editing first. My recording process is actually my final edit. So I'll do a second draft before I record, and then while I'm recording, I'm stopping and changing things if they don't sound that good if I read them aloud. And some of that is just because of the pace that I have to keep up. I'd love to do a second pass in general, so I can kind of kill two birds with one stone by recording and editing at the same time. And then, all the effects and things like that, the sound beds, I used to make all of those myself as well. A couple years ago, I started buying assets online, some audio assets and things to add just to save myself a little bit of time and to get some just higher quality stuff from people who really know what they're doing in that regard. And that post-production where I'm adding the effects and things, that's always the last step. I'm usually doing that right before I upload it. And I try not to rely too much on those sorts of things to deliver the impact of the story. It is nice to know that it's there in the end. If I record something and I really just feel like I didn't quite deliver the impact that I was trying to with that passage or whatever it may be, it is kind of nice to know that I can add a creepy sound bed or something like that just to bring out the atmosphere if I didn't quite capture it in the writing. The writing is my primary focus, and I try to craft the stories in a way that if I were to do no post-production at all, it would still stand on its own.
And when you listen back to them, I assume that you don't dwell a lot on them because you have quite a pace on, but when you go back, how often do you wish you would do things differently? I assume, okay, all of us that write anything would be like, I need to do that, but what's the key thing you've picked up on the way that you now do differently?
Listening back to them, I don't listen too often to older stories unless I'm trying to connect something I'm currently writing to a past story. And what I find more often than not is more problems in my own delivery, my narration, things that I wish I'd done differently, maybe added more differentiation between characters and things like that. But, those are things that I think I'm just trying to constantly improve on the whole time, and just always looking for little things like that. I think those little details are what can set somebody apart. I get comments all the time that people enjoy my narration style, which has always blown me away because I've never pursued that. It was more a means to an end. I've never taken any sort of training or classes in that. Oh, there you go, you're haunted.
Yeah, you see it.
So I suppose I'm just sort of fortunate that that skill set fell into it.
Now, when you say means to an end, you probably thought about later on you'll add somebody to do that for you, and now thinking about it, you've built quite a backlog. Would you still consider changing that on? And if you like do audiobooks for the stuff you've written, especially like things that aren't online, that are just in the book form, would you find somebody else to do it, or are you now going full on like I'm doing all of my stuff alone?
I've kind of trapped myself into being my own narrator. I have actually done my audiobooks as well. And, you know, I think people associate my voice so much with my work at this point that if I were to try to have someone else do it, it probably wouldn't go over very well and wouldn't be very successful. And, you know, I can't say I love the recording process, but I do enjoy, you know, no one's going to know my work better than me. So being able to really emphasize the characteristics of the characters that I've imagined for myself is a nice way to sort of give it that little push to really deliver the story. Where someone else, you know, a professional voice actor might do a better job of that. But I think what would be missing is the connection that the audience has found with me.
I can imagine now you have built an audience for yourself, but how often people still think that the stories aren't yours because of the professional sounding podcast and the sound beds and everything? I can imagine a lot of people still think that this is because you got a lot of channels going on that are just doing some other people's work. So does that happen to you still?
Oh yeah. Usually it's somebody who's just found my channel, and they're particularly on YouTube for some reason. That seems to be the place that people get confused. And I suppose it's understandable. You know, I don't really start out my episodes by explaining that the stories are by me. I have sort of a dramatic intro, and then I just get straight into the story itself. But I get a few people will comment and asking, you know, if the stories are real. People that don't realize that I'm the author that are criticizing the story and things like that, which is totally fine. But I can always tell when somebody doesn't realize that I'm writing them. You know, usually the comment is something along the lines of like, where do you find these stories?
It's interesting because a lot of your stories do dwell into some, let's say, weird things, and like people thinking that's a true story. That's interesting from their side. But I think that even though I've caught on fairly quickly that that's the original work, and I saw the description later on, but actually I am among a lot of people who listen to like those quote unquote true stories, and it's interesting seeing that a lot of people now have developed a habit listening to those, like even when they're going to bed or like just doing some like winding down. And what do you think about that? I'm sure that a lot of your audience came from that too. And now it's basically a trend of people listening, especially on YouTube, as you said, people listening to horror to wind down. So what's your stance on that?
Yeah, you know, I've never understood that myself personally, but I can understand it from the perspective of the people who do it. I think there's something about horror that horror fans just find comforting, and I've constantly wrestled with what that is. I think some of it is just, you know, when the world is so crazy or your life is so stressful, externalizing that stress onto something else that's far worse than anything you can imagine. And I think also, you know, it might be a different experience for somebody who genuinely believes that all of these stories are true, whereas I think most people that listen to supposedly true stories understand that they may not be entirely true, and so it's more just fun. But you know, I've listened to a few different horror narrators, particularly on YouTube, and there's something about it that seems to bring out this mellow, sort of calming voice in people as they're trying to create an atmosphere that's a little bit more chilling and dark, but what can come across as sort of relaxed sounding. You know, nobody's yelling at each other or, you know, things like that, like a news show might contain. And
and rain sounds like comforting, like snowstorm, fire crackling.
Exactly. Yep, a thunderstorm in the background or something like that. I think as people are falling asleep, maybe they're not even really listening to the words as so much as just the sound of it. And there's something about horror that just creates an atmosphere that's very, it's like a warm blanket those who like it.
Yeah, it's interesting, like comparing a warm blanket to stories about monsters and people dying.
I know. Yeah, I know it. But it's funny when I think about like the comfort movies. Like people always talk about what's the movie you go to when you've had a bad day and you just sit. For me, it's going to be something like Sinister or I don't even know, Hereditary, The Witch, something like that. The Robert Eggers kind of atmospheric horror is just, that to me that's a comfort for whatever reason.
That's understandable. I actually had like this 3D version of The Mist by Stephen King, 3D audio version, and I listened to that like 20 times. I don't know if you heard that, but it's like an abridged version. It's not like the same as the novella, but it has like some effects. It's not too much. It doesn't go all the way out, but like some sounds, some people moving around the store. And for me, that was really, really cool because compared to the actual contents of the story, which is harrowing, but still that like the vibe of it really sounds strange, but it's awesome.
No, absolutely. And that's one of the benefits of audio versus print. I'm a big reader. I read a lot, but I also consume so much horror through audio, different podcasts and audiobooks and things like that. And when you really just want to get immersed in something, that, especially wearing headphones, the atmospheres that people create through audio, I think just draws you in and really holds you. It kind of helps you feel like you're a part of that world too, which is, I think, especially awesome when it's something so supernatural types things that you don't really experience so much in our base reality, but you can kind of augment your reality to include those things through different sound effects and atmospheres.
Yeah, and I think that that especially works for shorter work, because for me, I talked to one of my previous guests about, like, for me, reading or listening to an audiobook of a longer form novel or even a series, that's kind of tough if I don't have to like sit down, and if I can't sit down and just like focus on it, because if doing something else, people like commuting, driving, and for me that doesn't work for a larger world. But if it's like bite-sized like story, that's really good. And back onto your process, when you write your shorter stories, what's the first thing that you lay down, because you have the audio form you have to think about, but does this really impact, like, compared to the other work you've written that's just in the written form, or later on audiobooks but that's not written especially for the podcast? How do you go about it? Because I know that process may be different, but still, as you said, you want them to stand on their own, so what's the balance there?
Yeah, like I said, the writing always comes first. That I always try to make sure that I'm not leaning too heavily on the audio format, but it does also kind of limit me in that there's certain maybe types of characters that I can't include. If I want to include somebody that speaks differently from me, I have to keep that in mind, that I'm going to be narrating, and at this time I don't have other actors involved, and maybe that's something that I'll look at in the future. I've certainly thought about it, to be able to write a more diverse cast of characters, because unless it's a voice that I feel confident that I can imitate without being annoying or offensive, I am not really able to include dialogue from those characters. At least they may be able to exist in the background, but they can't really speak. So there's things like that I have to keep in mind. But beyond that, I try to treat it almost like I'm writing something that, for an audiobook. I almost ignore the fact that it's for a podcast until it comes time to really record it. Because I want these to exist as stories that can be in any format.
And now, because you've got a quite of a backlog, you have done different types of horror, but as we discussed, the vibes are there, and I think that it's really now noticeable, as I've listened to quite a lot of your stories, that the style comes through. But how long did it take you to just branch out? What's the type of horror you feel most at home at? Because you got the Warning Woods and the series you're building on top of that. You got some recurring characters and some stories that now are slowly tying back to some things that you've done. It was that like, okay, I'm gonna build to that, and the name was there, or you're kind of just discovering along the way and exploring different venues of horror?
Yeah, it's been a long process that's kind of taken this entire time. So the name of the podcast being The Warning Woods was something of a mistake. I actually regretted it for a while because it didn't end up really making sense after even just a few weeks. I had this initial idea that because my idea for this podcast at first just came from walking in the woods. I have some woods near my house that I'll just walk through sometimes on a lunch break or something like that. And so I was thinking, I'm walking through these woods and I'm seeing signs. There's like a squirrel carcass off the path, or something horrible has happened, and there's just a smell in the air of a dead fish, maybe from the bank of the stream. There's signs everywhere that terrible things have happened. Natural things, they're all part of the course of life, but if you were to put it on yourself, it'd be a horrible thing, right? So I got this idea of these warnings in the woods, and maybe each of these stories could connect to some sort of warning. That was sort of the original concept. I really didn't plan on doing it for years and years and years. I thought I would just kind of do it for as long as it took to build an audience and then return to writing novels. Then it started to get some momentum and pick up steam, and I had the name on there attached, The Warning Woods. Everybody knew that name, and it wasn't really tied to anything. So I struggled with that for a while until I had the idea to use some of my recurring characters and tie them together into a larger story that is still in process, and connect them all to a place called The Warning Woods, which is where the creatures from this universe, both supernatural and these more cryptid type creatures, emerge from, or it's at least one of the places. So now I kind of have a universe. I built sort of a. I assume you're familiar with the Dark Tower. I listened to one of your interviews talking about that. The way not to spoil anything, but the way Stephen King sort of inserts himself in that universe and connects all of the various works that he's had up until that point into that. That's sort of what The Warning Woods is now. It's kind of a container for all of my different ideas. And that's had this sort of cascading effect of allowing me to explore different avenues of horror and keep it in that Warning Woods universe. I have stories like I did one called Legs that was a little bit more contemplative, a fairly simple ghost story, a little bit silly. There was an element of some tongue-in-cheek. The whole concept was this guy's up in this attic and this pair of legs keeps appearing, and it goes on from there. But it's just on its face sort of a silly idea that I were able to take that. And then just a couple weeks later, I did one called Dark Part Below, which was just pure horror, ventures into body horror even. And it's one of the rare stories where I've had audience members reach out and say they couldn't finish it, that it made them want to throw up, that they found that one a little rough. And then I did more of a gothic style ghost story, just as a palate cleanser, more or less, and I enjoy being able to jump between these different styles and different sort of subgenres within horror, because it just helps me to be more flexible as a writer and explore a variety of ideas.
And even though, as you mentioned, you have the woods behind your home and some of those influences, and I know the most cliche question, where do your ideas come from? Of course, from all over the place, but I can't help but notice the guitar, and so you have a story that's pretty tied to one guitar. We won't spoil anything, but how was it writing that kind of a story that's so close to home? Because, of course, all of the stories we write come from a place of at least a little bit of personal stuff, but doing something that's really that much closer to you, and when you now listen to the finished story and read it, how does that feel?
Those stories are some of my favorites, just because they tend to come together a little bit quicker than others, and I feel like I can, with less effort, put more detail into them. When I'm talking about something I'm really knowledgeable about, like music, specifically guitar, I can include those details that someone who is not a musician will not know, but they'll appreciate. And that's something that I really enjoy doing. I think when you get into those nitty-gritty details without going so far that it loses the plot or becomes obnoxious, it really helps ground the reader or the listener in the story, and they feel like they're more connected to the subject matter. A lot of times, I love like deep sea type stuff. I absolutely love anything that's underwater, but I live in the middle of Iowa, so far from the ocean that I have to do extensive research just to do a very basic story about the ocean. And so, that's kind of the difference there is stuff that I connect to personally that is already a part of my life. I can just write without thinking about, because I already know it. If that research element is involved, it just takes much longer, and I have to be cognizant of that when I start a story, that it might take me a couple extra days to get it done, because I'm going to have to really deep dive into whatever I'm writing about.
And when do you say, okay, I've done enough preparation? Because I know a lot of people get into that, like, I have the illusion I'm working on something, but in actuality I'm just like researching, preparing and not working on it. And you do have like a good pace, so obviously not a lot of writer's blocks are present, but still, when do you know, like, this is the idea I'm pursuing, I have what I need, and let's just get into it?
I kind of limit myself on how much time I'm allowed for research, and that tends to help. I'll give myself, basically every day I have an early morning session and a late night session, and more often than not that's writing, but sometimes it's recording or editing. I'll usually give myself 1 to 2 of those sessions to do research, and then any research I have to do beyond that point, I do it while I'm writing. So I'll start the story, and then while I'm in the middle, if I come across a passage where I need more detail than I have available, I'll do a little bit more research just to get that specific detail. And that keeps me from getting bogged down on the research side. There's pros and cons to that, though, because sometimes through the research, particularly if I find like a really good YouTube channel talking about it. I did a story about a container ship a while back, and I found this channel from a guy who lives on a container ship and just vlogs every trip that he takes. And I got lost in that for a couple days, just watching this guy in his daily life. And that can give you more ideas or help you dive deeper into your original idea in ways that you couldn't possibly have expected or known without pursuing that research first. So you kind of have to play it by feel. I think it depends on what the subject is, and if I'm feeling really drawn toward whatever it is as I'm researching it to pursue it, I'll start watching more, learning more in the time in between my sessions to try to spend some more time learning.
How often does it happen for you to script one of your stories when you've done some research, you got a cool idea, and you go into it, and you realize at some point that it's just not working? Does that happen? I mean, it obviously happens to everyone, but like, how often compared to your output?
Sure, I have a folder full of, I shouldn't say full, there's probably 4 or 5 unfinished stories. Some are further along than others. There's a couple of them that are just like a couple paragraphs before it took me, realizing that I'm not prepared for this one yet. And there's others that are pretty close to the end where I almost wrapped the story up before realizing there's some major plot hole that would take an inordinate amount of time to fill, and I'd better just start on something else in the meantime. So it does happen. I'd say it's pretty rare, probably less than 10% of the stories I start that'll happen to, because one of the things that writing a story every week does is it makes you very adept at changing course when needed. So, particularly when I had a specific deadline I was trying to meet, if it got to be a couple days before that story was due and I needed to record it and do the post-production, I had to find a workaround. There has to be some wrench that I can throw into the story, some unexpected event that'll change the course of the story so that I can get to the end a little bit quicker. Things like that I just have to figure out how to work around in order to meet that deadline. I don't have to do that as much anymore, but it's still a good skill to have.
What's like a point when you like have the aha moment? Because in horror specifically, a lot of times you got to have like a lot of build up for that moment, and I can imagine that writing so much as you did gets easier, but still, do you have like some now structure to it? How do you go about like structuring your stories, or is it something still that you do mostly by the feeling of it?
I started outlining in more detail a couple years ago. I used to just start, I'd take the idea and just run with it, and then those aha moments would kind of happen along the way. What I've started doing is spending more time sitting with the outline, thinking about the characters, and letting those sorts of moments happen in that stage. But it almost doesn't matter, because as I'm writing, they'll still just occur to me through the process. Even the story that I'm working on right now, unfortunately, I don't want to give anything away because it's not even done yet. But I had a very clear idea of where it was going to go. I thought I'd probably be able to write it in just a couple of days, maybe even less, because it was so concise, and I had it all figured out. And then last night, as I was working on it, I had one of those moments where I just go, oh, it'd be so much more interesting if I took it this way. So now I'm almost writing two versions of the story at the same time. I'm inserting portions that serve the new idea that will be easy to remove if I decide not to go that way in the end. And that's something that I'll do somewhat frequently just because of the pace, if I find that pursuing an idea is taking more time, or if I'm starting to lose the original idea of the story in something new that's come along, I figure out how to remove that and maybe save it for another story, or just decide when something just has to go, unfortunately. But yeah, having the pace keeps me, you mentioned writer's block, it keeps that from happening. It keeps me from getting in that paralysis by analysis, they call it, where you have so many different ideas or directions you could go that you just end up freezing in place. I had to learn very early on how to avoid that. And, to be honest, it's a lot of just pushing through, just doing the work.
And how do you do that? Because now thinking about it, those are self-imposed deadlines, and now you do have a larger audience, and you don't want to disappoint them, obviously, and you like what you do, but still, a lot of people, especially writers, struggle with that. So do you have a secret ingredient for that, or just you've been always that way?
I have a hard time. I have complicated feelings about this because I'm finding now that the hard deadline is harming the product, which is why I've done away with it, and I've decided just to put the stories out as they're finished. I still am roughly releasing one story per week, but I have a looser time frame on that. But at the same time, that prevented me from spending any time overthinking or not having an idea. The option to not have an idea was not there. If I had, writer's block or something like that, where I really didn't know what I was going to do, I had to just switch to something else. I had to abandon that story and start writing something new that maybe excited me. Or I would find a movie or a YouTube video or something that was kind of in the same vein and shamelessly copy that thing to start. And then once I got going, make it my own, and then maybe go back and remove the part that was copied. But sometimes just writing something, even if it's not going to be the final product, just getting the thought process going, forcing yourself to sit down, that is very helpful. And I think having a strict deadline forced me to learn that to the point where I don't even really think about it anymore. Even though I don't have the deadline anymore, I still feel that pressure just to get started on something, whatever that's going to be. So it might not be what I originally sat down to work on, but I'm going to write something. I'm going to type something, and then eventually the ideas start to flow, and you kind of break out of that writer's block.
And what do you look for in horror when you read or when you set out to complete the story? What's the thing that for you successful horror does?
We talked about vibes a little bit. I think that's really what I look for, is a particular mood or atmosphere. I mentioned Robert Eggers earlier. His new Nosferatu, that really dark cinematic type of horror. When I'm looking for something to consume, it is a lot of what I lean towards. I'm a huge fan of Stephen King as well, obviously. And so, anything that's weird, I guess. I'm not a huge fan of slashers and things like that. They can be fun. I loved Stephen Graham Jones's the Indian Lake trilogy that he did. It's sort of a slasher. There's other elements to those stories as well. But when it comes to what I really resonate with, the murder type stuff, serial killer things, they're interesting, but I really lean towards supernatural, very dark, sort of moody things. I mentioned Hereditary and The Witch. Midsummer is one of my favorites. That's actually interesting because it's visually very bright and colorful, but the underlying atmosphere is so dark and heavy. Maybe upsetting is the right word. I like things that really just perturb the senses. that's kind of what I gravitate towards.
And daylight horror is especially good at that because, as you mentioned, Midsummer, things that are usually reserved for the dark, moody settings, when you put them in the daylight, that can be really good.
Yes, absolutely. It's very rare too. You don't see a lot of it. It's something I'm actually looking to do more of is daytime. Whether it's apparitions or things just happening that are strange. We're so used to that in the night that it feels almost cliche or too familiar, maybe expected. To have things occurring during the day that are really upsetting and unsettling, I think is sort of a new direction to look at.
Yeah, recently I saw what's the name of it? A Woman in the Yard. I think that's the name of it, and it's really, the setup is really there for that. For me, the ending was a bit lackluster, but the first half of it, when they're just setting up, and it's so simple when you look at it, just like there's a woman in the yard sitting in a chair, and that's it. And what's going on with that? It's just being ominous, but as you said, not a lot of people do that. And you also mentioned underwater horror and generally water-related stuff. And for me, that's also quite some time missing. There are some things, but they usually just gravitate to like a bit pulpy creatures like sharks, stuff like that. Mm-hmm. But there isn't a lot of it, so I think that's also like the ground could use some new work. And also the trend of for a while now, like a few years back, the grief horror. What do you think about that? I know that slowly people have been kind of getting tired of it, and the so-called elevated horror. I mean, that sounds now even derogatory, but there are quite a few good films that came out from that way, but also a bunch of them that just like don't hit as hard as, let's say, Hereditary or like Babadook or whatever. And like in books as well, I mean, Pet Sematary could go into that category, so it's not that new. There were some works, of course, throughout the years, but especially like last few years, I'm getting a feeling that's been something that's been in the focus.
Yeah, definitely. You know, I think anytime a Hereditary comes out, or any movie that does something that's familiar but in a new way and is widely successful, you're bound to see copycats and you know, for years after we've seen that the grief explored in horror. And I've certainly done it myself too. You know, I'm certainly prone to that. I really aim to highlight human emotion in my stories. I really try to capture that. So what I've been doing lately, because I myself have been feeling a little bit worn out on the grief thing, both as a fan and a writer, I've been looking for other emotions that, you know, maybe have not gone unexplored, but need to be looked at again. So anger has been a real focus of mine lately, particularly in terms of revenge. I did a story called The Punishment that was written from the perspective of a ghost that was seeking revenge for the loss of his child. And, you know, in a way that does explore grief. You know, I think anger is very closely tied to sadness and grief. But looking for the different ways that can manifest, we obviously, like, you could go into evil spirits and things like that. There's so many stories about demons capitalizing or even causing anger, things like that. So anger is one. I've explored jealousy is one that I've looked at very closely. I wrote a story actually called Jealousy that looked at that. You know, I think anxiety sort of exists in all horror, but looking at sort of the really acute causes of, or maybe effects of anxiety. You know, I'm looking for different ways to do that sort of elevated horror thing, but without leaning on the tropes that have sort of developed since maybe 2015 onward. The last decade has been full of that, to the point where I think people are pretty ready for something else. I think that's why we're seeing the comeback of some of the lighter-hearted slasher type horror. I have a subscription to Shudder, and a lot of the stuff that comes out on there is horror comedy. You know, there's a lot of sort of over-the-top things where we're just clearly having fun. Movies like Cocaine Bear being so popular, I think, is just because people they're done sitting with their feelings. They're ready to just go have an experience, have some fun, and then move on from it. So finding a balance there, because, I love consuming that. I don't know if that's where my skill set as a writer lies, is in the more lighthearted stuff. I really tend to focus on introspective things, but looking for ways to do that are new, I think, is going to be important in the next few years.
Finding ways to be new, for me, that's also interesting, because I saw a video on your channel when you did like a sort of a Q&A, and you also mentioned that Edgar Allan Poe is one of your favorite authors, and comparing like that, and you as you said, you were working on a gothic story recently and ghost stories in general, and now taking from that compared to some of the modern works, be it film or books, games even, what do you think are things that could be taken from each era to make something that's now more relevant? Because of course a lot of people still gravitate towards the classic, but still the modern audiences are getting used to some more dynamic, different types of writing. So what's the balance for you when you like go back to some of the older stuff now compared to something that you've enjoyed more recently? What's the common ground there, except from vibes?
Yeah. Right. Yeah. There's something difficult about writing modern stories that I think make going back to those older, the Edgar Allan Poe sort of era, really appealing. Before there was phones and the internet, and something strange happening was really genuinely mysterious, and you couldn't just Google what was happening and figure out, oh, it's because these certain sound waves are causing this effect, or whatever it is. So I think finding ways to take modern characters and remove them from the modern world, if that makes sense, or just finding ways to sort of separate the technology out of it can be tricky. I think what Poe was doing, both with his poetry and prose, was what has become the sort of modern elevated horror. I think really, think about like The Telltale Heart, a very simple story, but the horror is really all internal. It's this guy's experience is what is so awful and resonates so much in the readers, and you can still do that in modern settings. So I think what you have to do is now consider that most readers are not looking to read eloquent prose. They want to be able to quickly consume things too. So being able to capture the depth of, say, a Poe story with the simplicity of modern writing is maybe where that balance lies.
And what are some examples that you came by in the last couple of years? Who do you think, except from your work, does that good?
I just read a book called The Lamb by Lucy Rose, and I feel like that one perfectly encapsulates what I'm talking about, where the writing is very simple, and I don't mean that in a derogatory way at all. It's very concise. It's poetic in just the right amount of ways, but it doesn't rely too much on big vocabulary and things like that are going to throw people off. But the story itself it's so simple. I could probably tell you the whole story here in 5 minutes. I could sum it up, but it fills this whole book with this character's experience, how she's feeling, how it connects to her past, what she perceives going forward, and that sort of personal turmoil that she's experiencing is very well done, very well written. And so that one is one in particular that I really enjoyed, specifically for the reasons I just described.
That sounds interesting. I haven't read that one, but thinking about it, a lot of great horror stories that I did read can be described as that in a couple of minutes, but the feeling in it is there. And I also noticed that slowly we've been seeing some mixes, as you said, in movies there's a comedic part to it, a lot of things that are more lighthearted, but also mixing with some other genres or settings that are unexpected. People moving into, of course, sci-fi and horror are often complementary, but also slowly epic fantasy has some elements, especially grimdark writers can do that. And for me, it's been interesting seeing what people can do with that as well. So
hopefully we'll see more of that too. I don't know if you're like familiar with, of course, I mean, a lot of people have heard it now from the TV series, but like Dan Simmons, I think that did that really good in the Terror and stuff like that.
I have not seen that yet. I've heard it's been recommended to me over and over again. I need to check that one out because I hear nothing but good things.
Yeah, it's really a good vibe.
Okay.
For, like, the horror blanket vibes, as you mentioned. But thinking about like the longer form horror, now that you kind of established your pace with the shorter form and you've written a lot of stories, you've done some longer form. But what do you think is the main difference for you now moving forward to going on to write some more novels? What will be different for you in the process when you think about the story as a whole? How do you approach that?
It's tough to know for sure because I wrote both of my novels very early on. The first novel was the first thing I'd really written since like college, and that wasn't even really creative writing. It was the first creative writing I'd probably done since high school. So I learned a lot just through that, and then the second book I did shortly after that. I think, the way I would tackle it now, because I have lots of different ideas for a book, is I need to know for sure that whatever the idea is can last for many more pages than what I'm used to doing. But I kind of look forward to that because there's a lot that I leave out of my short stories, things that I imagine my characters thinking or feeling that I maybe don't have to express to serve the current story, so I leave out because I don't want the listener to get bored or lost in some of the background things. But the characters that I have in my mind are usually much deeper than what actually ends up in the story. So the way I see writing a novel now is almost like at the beginning you're starting in the middle, and then it will sort of branch out in two directions. The plot will drive forward, but as the plot moves forward, the characters are going to be looking backwards as the types of things that led them to where they're at now. I think sort of moving in both directions like that is something that I'm not able to do as much in the short stories. I kind of have to pick up the characters where they're at the beginning of the story and then just move forward without really exploring too much of the background. And that's a shame because, if you just think about human experience in general, anybody that you meet on any given day, they're going to continue to have a future, but they also have a past that is going to inform every action that they do, everything they say, everything they think is all going to be informed by that formative experience. And I want to be able to explore that more because I think it's hard to find something that is unique in horror that is completely 100% original at this point. Everything's kind of been done to some extent, but what you can still play with is how different people experience those things. And I think being able to explore people's backstory and past gives you more to play with in these scenarios where you want to bring in the horror elements. You can kind of make things more or less intense based on who your characters are. So I think that's the main difference, is that I want to be able to not necessarily expand the scope of the story or the plot, but the characters.
Yeah, I think that a lot of people, as you mentioned, like for example Stephen King, I also quite like reading Stephen King. He's one of my favorite writers as well, and I think that one of the things that stands out even in his non-horror works is that character-driven stories, and I think that made him who he is. And a lot of stories, as you mentioned, slashers, I don't think that they often hit as well because the characters aren't simply there because they are rushed into the story. There is a lot of them and you don't feel it. So I think that really makes the difference. And when you think about people reacting to it, you have the audience, but your surroundings, people around you, and some stereotypes and some prejudice that's tied to horror still, even though it's getting quite mainstream in the recent years. How do you deal with that? How do people react for you for your work, like when people realize the type of work you put out?
It's funny. My style just comes across as, I think, sort of safe in a way. A lot of my endings wrap up relatively nicely as they can. I have some actual happy endings and things like that. I don't use much for like crude language. I'm not necessarily over the top with the gore and things like that. So I've sort of accumulated an audience that is looking for horror they can consume that's not necessarily going to scar them, which is interesting. You're talking about like things getting more mainstream. I almost feel like that might be part of the recipe for reaching more of a mainstream audience, because you look at like, you know, something like Terrifier, which I love that franchise. That is never going to, I mean, it's obviously bigger than I think anyone expected it to be, but I'm never going to be able to sit down with you know, my wife who doesn't enjoy horror at all and show her Terrifier. Whereas I could probably get her through something like Midsummer, where it's not as necessarily like offensive to the senses as much as it is just the subconscious. So, you know, I that made me a little bit uncomfortable for a while when I started seeing, you know, I get reviews or emails and things like that from 10-year-old kids sometimes, talking about how much they like my work, which is great. That's about the age that I got into horror. So I'm like, that's awesome. But at the same time, you know, it makes me wonder sometimes, like, do I need to turn it up in some ways, you know? And so that's why I also like to include a lot of variety in the stories, because sometimes I'll put something out that is a little bit more visceral, to kind of shake things up and make sure people don't expect things to always be neat and tidy. I don't know if I've even answered your original question. I think I've gotten a little bit off.
No,
but
it's good.
yeah, that's just something that I've observed with my specific audience, and I seem to get the most positive reactions from the stories that are a little bit hopeful, I think is the word I would use, you know, where maybe something terrible has happened, but the experience has taught the characters something that they're going to carry on into their life and improve them in some way.
That makes a lot of sense. And we've mentioned the audience a few times, but how did you go about finding your audience? Like, of course, a lot of people just gravitated towards your work because they were looking for something, but what were some steps do you think that made your work as popular as it is? And of course, the growing audience. For example, for me, it's interesting, like the Halloween specials that you did in installments, which isn't usually the case. You've got mostly like standalone stuff. You said you were starting to expand it into the universe, but still some standalone stuff. Was that one of the, like, it maybe not say tactics, but approaches to garner like a wider audience?
Absolutely, yeah. No, you nailed it. The Halloween specials came about because I essentially realized that October and kind of in that Halloween season is when most people are going to be looking for this type of content. So I wanted to, for lack of a better term, just be spamming the algorithm with my show during that season. And I do consistently every year see roughly like a 15% growth during that phase. And then it sort of tapers off afterwards just a little bit. But I usually retain a few listeners from that. So that is absolutely one of the things. I can't take credit for all of it. You know, I got really fortunate, or maybe it's just a result of being consistent with releasing the episodes. But for whatever reason, I got the attention of some folks over at Spotify. They set me up with a direct contact there. Her name's Adele, and she has been amazing at getting banner ads and things like that I have not had to ask for or pay for. It's just a part of the way they're promoting podcasts right now. They're really, really trying to become like the podcast app over at Spotify. So I've kind of benefited from that. And again, that's nothing that I can say that I really did or had anything to do with. But I've definitely benefited from that. And then kind of the last step was I started to realize a couple years ago that I had a sizable audience that I was just kind of sitting with. And so I sought out a network. I'm with Realm now, and they've really helped me promote the show and done some cross promotion with other shows and things like that they've done. So that's been good. You know, if I were to sum up the experience in advice for someone, it's just be consistent, do that hard work, and take every opportunity that comes your way, no matter how small. You know, I've been on a few different podcasts and things like that. I always try to say yes to an interview. If somebody reaches out that wants to do some sort of promotion, I always try to do that if I can. Now that I'm on a network, I have to pass some of that off, to other people. But to get to that point where a network would be interested in your show, you really got to show that you can be consistent, do that hard work, keep it up, and then just respond to every opportunity you can.
That's some solid advice. And seeing you've done also some merch, you got a Patreon. How does that feel to you, like juggling everything? I'm sure that like you would love to have at some point a team that could handle everything, but now like setting all those things and slowly moving into that business sides of things, even though you're creative at the core of it, you're putting out your work, and as you said, you're in it for the writing. But still, now as you've described how everything works, how does that process feel for you, and like what would you want to do like differently, like going forward?
Well, yeah, if I could do nothing but write, that's what I would choose to do. It is just me over here, so I do everything. The merch store, just being honest and realistic, I lose money on that every year. The monthly cost of maintaining that website outweighs the profit that I get, but it's just something that I maintain for my audience, that wants that sort of thing. I set it up just out of demand. There was a lot of people asking for it, and so I figured it out and did it. But yeah, I'd love to have a team, and maybe someday this will get to a point where I could do that and have somebody running the merch store, have somebody organizing the Patreon a little bit better, because that's absolutely something that I would enjoy putting more attention into. The Patreon community is really special to me because these are people that I consistently communicate with and that talk to me, and around things like when I decided to back off on the schedule, and there's a real potential that means there may be some months where I don't release as many episodes as I was. And so when I made that announcement to the Patreon community, I told them, if I do find that I'm consistently putting out less episodes because of this, I'll bring the price down, because what they initially agreed to pay for is decreasing, right? And the reaction I got from them was just like, no, we're paying for your work, however much it is. We're happy to do that. And so they're a really great group for me to rely on. They give me great feedback. And that's something that I will never completely pass off to someone else. I always want to be directly involved in that. But, outside of that, if I could just do nothing but writing, I'd love to learn how to do some screenplays, and I'd love to do more novels and things like that. So, that might be something I look at in the future if this continues to grow, adding more people to this one-man crew.
That's great. And now that you've come this way and slowly grown your audience and everything you've discussed, how, like, starting like from scratch, now seeing the Patreon growing and getting feedback, how did that, if at all, like impact your writing? Of course, like it's good having like people gravitating towards it, but as you get the feedback and like reviews, did you notice like something different? Because I know that, like, especially from in that phase, growing without the audience and now getting some people who are really there for your work, how does that feel for you?
In a weird way that I didn't expect, it's kind of liberating. Because I do such a wide variety of stories, seeing consistently positive feedback from specifically that Patreon community, but there's some folks on Spotify that comment all the time, and on YouTube, where I can see the username, so I know it's always like the same people. I kind of feel like these people want to hear whatever I am going to put out. They're not looking for a specific type of story. Some of them will say that they prefer one type or the other, but they're still there, they're still listening, they're still enjoying it. So that's kind of opened me up to being able to try new things, like that story I mentioned, Legs. That was so far out there compared to a lot of the other things I've done, that I think at a different point in my experience as a writer, I would have probably not pursued that, because I would have been worried that would turn so many people off. But I went for it, and there was a few people, more than usual, that said that one wasn't for them, and they prefer other stories, which is absolutely fine, and I fully expected. But I have the comfort of knowing that these people just want to hear my voice, both literally because I'm narrating it, and also just my writing voice. And so that's been one way it's affected it, and also it keeps me motivated because these people are pretty dedicated to me and my stories, and there is no part of me that feels comfortable selling that short, being lazy in 1 week or putting out a story that I haven't fully committed to. I feel like I really owe it to them to put everything I possibly can into these stories. So that motivation definitely comes in any week where I'm feeling particularly unmotivated or uninspired. I can kind of just imagine them waiting for something from me and that expectation. And I really want to give them something that they'll enjoy. So that kind of drives me through those down moments.
And Story Legs is quite different from a lot of your other stories, but even further, there's something you would at some point like to try that you even maybe goes out of the realm of horror that you aren't currently doing, but is kind of down the line, something you would like to try?
Absolutely. I have two ideas. One of them is probably a novella. The other is a novel that I've been thinking about for a very long time. It'll probably be the next novel I write. There will certainly be horror elements, but it's more of a, how would I even describe it? It's more of a thriller, sort of psychological, and it's about a stalker that is hunting down, not quite literally, but sort of literally, a celebrity singer that he is in love with after the apocalypse has happened. So imagine like The Stand, the journey across the country, but instead of pursuing somewhere to live, he's seeking out this famous singer because now most other people are gone. He feels like he has an actual chance to be with this woman. So that's one of them. And then the other one, I haven't really thought about too much because I don't know if I'll actually do this, but I have been kicking around an idea of sort of a horror romance or maybe even like erotica type book with some supernatural elements that would be more silly and fun than anything else that I've been doing. So those are sort of two different ideas. I think, sort of like Stephen King, who just always finds his way into these conversations no matter what. Even when he's not writing horror, there's something in there that is unsettling or disturbing, whether it's Shawshank or whatever, there's something in there that ties it back to his roots in horror. I'm probably cursed the same way. I don't know if I'll ever be able to fully branch away and leave it behind. Not that I'd even want to, but I think finding ways to look at other genres and still include a little bit of those horror elements is probably what I'll be doing in the future.
Makes sense, and I really do the idea about the post-apocalyptic stalker, but not like the game.
Right.
Yeah, so before I let you go, I usually ask people what's next, but you kind of answered that already, so I'd like to leave off with some maybe one or like a couple of your stories that you feel like somebody who hasn't heard of you yet would be like best going to get the feel of what your vibes are.
Yeah, I'll go with an older one and then a newer one, because I have an older one that I'm consistently proud of called Shepherdess. That's one that I really enjoy. It's one of those stories where it felt pretty basic until I got to the end and I had one of those aha moments that we talked about earlier, and that really just tied it together. And I think it sort of encompasses everything that is definitive about my style, that one. And then recently, the Lucas County incident is a story that I would recommend. Sort of a vampire story, little more action than I usually put in my stories, but really resonated well with the audience, and just a story that I had the most fun writing. I think even since I was maybe about a month ago now, and I still think back on writing that story, just like how do I do that again? That was a really good time. So I'd recommend those two.
Nice. The first one I'll have to seek out, but the second one I actually recently listened to on a bus, and
oh, great.
It was a night bus, and it was quite the experience. So I second that.
Great.
So yeah. Well, thanks, Miles, for coming on to Storyline Sessions and being so open to sharing your experience so far. And yeah, we'll be definitely keeping an eye out for everything you do in the future and sharing links so people can see it. And yeah, we'll be in touch.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. This has been a great conversation.
Thank you, same. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you for tuning in to another episode of the Storyline Sessions podcast. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. You can find Miles using the links below, and if you're interested in storytelling in any kind of media, keep following the Storyline Sessions, both here and on Instagram. My name is Marco, and I'll see you next time. Keep creating stories.